have two students who are going to start us off today. The first is Aryaman Hati, who's reading a poem, Graduating.
Hi, I'm Aryaman. I'm a junior, and I call this poem Graduating not just because it's what I hope to do next year, but also because graduation is coming pretty soon. It's pretty crazy. This semester is already almost over. In a week, there are only 2 months left until I become a senior and I have to get ready to leave this place. I want to be here, walking through hallways, through conversations, sitting in the same seat through the same moment, a different day, but the same faces, planting new steps, yet walking nowhere. Time takes me through a journey, but moments rest at their birth. As I leave them behind, I'm forced to call them memories, memories to be forgotten. With my friends, I experience what happens, but now I say experienced what happened, and it seems I forgot. Every moment in ending eternity, I don't want it to slip away from me. I want to grow towards something, not away from what I have. I want to be a part of something, not detached from what I have. 3 years of being here, 3 years of memories. Will I remember any of them? Memories are as lively as a smile, but the smile is fading away. Remember when? No, I don't. I don't want to remember what it's like to be here. I don't want to remember what it's like to be here. I don't want to forget what it's like to be here. While a smile still rests on my face, I want to be here right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Aryaman. Our next speaker is also reading a poem that she wrote. Please welcome Emily Monahan.
Hi, thank you. My name is Emily, in case you don't already know. I'm reading a poem that I actually published in Slant of Light last year, but I know none of you read that, so here we go. I once dreamed a purple sunset, and it danced across the lake, and the things we were afraid of seemed irrelevant and fake. And so we danced together, hand in hand and arm, and we watched the water ripple while the evening was still warm. And when the cool night took us and she seeped into our skin, we held each other tighter, strangers, neighbors, brothers, kin. And at last the war was over, and at last mankind was free. And when I woke, I wept for sunsets that will never be. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Our guest today is an award-winning freelance travel writer who has reported from 7 continents for publications like the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Time Magazine, Food and Wine, and others. She's a contributing editor at Condé Nast Traveler and is on the faculty of the Columbia School of Journalism's Columbia Publishing course. Her work was chosen for the Best American Travel Writing in 2021, and she has won numerous awards, including an honorable mention as Travel Journalist of the Year in the 2020 Lowell Thomas Travel Journalism Awards. She is a disciple of maps, a connoisseur of global junk food, a hoarder of hotel pens, and a master at sleeping through long-haul flights. Please welcome Sarah Khan.
Thank you so much, and hi everyone. How are you guys doing? Yeah? Everyone excited to be here? No one's gonna nap through this one? All right, so I'm Sarah Khan, and as you heard, I am a travel writer, which means I get told over and over that I have a dream job. And you know what? I kind of do. I'm not gonna argue with that. I get paid to explore the world and report back what I see. And because of my work, I've been to all 7 continents, both poles. to write for the New York Times, Condé Nast Traveler, Food and Wine, and many, many other publications. And in fact, if you go to a newsstand right now, this is Bon Appetit magazine. It's a food magazine that maybe some of you have heard of, or maybe your parents get. And I have the cover story, which is about a restaurant I went to in India last year. So that I have out right now. I also have stories in Time magazine and Condé Nast Traveler this month. So this is basically everything I've wanted to do my whole career, which I will get to in a minute. But before we get there, whenever I travel, I always post on my social media, and I make people guess where in the world is Sarah Khan. So I'm going to test that with you guys. And if you were here in earlier periods, please don't guess. So does anyone have a guess for this one? Detroit? Very close, not at all actually. Anyone else? Very far from Detroit. Not in America. Anyone? It is in Africa, so does anyone want to guess where? Up there? Algeria. It is Algeria, which I'm guessing you were here before, or did you just guess that? All right. This was in the Sahara Desert in Algeria. This one? Anyone who wasn't in the last period? Greece. Not Greece. It is in Europe, though. Bosnia? Did someone say Bosnia? It is. It is Bosnia. It's not Detroit. Some big Detroit fans here. Interesting. All right, and this one? Sorry guys, I actually don't have any pictures of me in Detroit. Now I really wish I did. I want to go back and redo this. This is in India, in a part of South India called Hampi, that is known for this distinct rocky landscape. And that is me in high school, Sharon, Massachusetts, 1999. And that is me in Antarctica in 2022, which, fun fact, is a year I went to all 7 continents in 6 months. And so how did I get here? How did I get from Sharon High to reporting in the jungle in Sri Lanka, in a city in Uzbekistan, and floating around somewhere near the North Pole? So I'm going to tell you a bit about my career, but just know that if this is something you might even be remotely interested in, there are so many different paths to get here now than there were 20 years ago when I got started. So like when I was starting, there was barely any social media, whereas now it's an entire career you can do at a magazine. So what I did, so I wanted to be a journalist since I was 8 years old. There's nothing else I've ever wanted to do. I was born in Canada, grew up in Saudi Arabia and India, and when I was in Saudi Arabia, my dad worked for the airline, which meant we traveled a lot, and my mother was working as a freelance journalist, writing about culture and food and travel, so I was exposed to these ideas at a really young age, and it's fitting that, you know, many years later, I'm now combining both of those things into my career. So even though I wanted to be a journalist from such a young age, I didn't actually do much about it in high school and college. I wrote a little bit for the high school paper, a little bit for the college paper. In college, I went to Boston College and majored in English and communications, and then I went to Syracuse and got a master's in journalism there. But I didn't intern in media or anything like that. I wasn't doing that much about it. So I think, you know, don't worry about, if this is something you're even remotely interested in, don't worry about specializing in it too early. It's almost better to go get a major in econ or history or just something else so you can have more expertise in the world and just know more about different things. And journalism is something you can definitely learn on the job as you go. Oh wait, I was supposed to tell you more about my career, wasn't I? So I worked, my first job after grad school was in public relations in Boston. But then I knew I wanted to be a journalist, so after a year, I was like, at that point, I need to move to New York if I want to be a journalist, because 20 years ago, that was a hub for all things media. Now things have changed, you can do it from a lot of different places, and I would argue, actually, if you want to be a travel journalist like me, you're probably better off not being in New York. But 20 years ago, that was kind of where you had to be, so I moved there, would have taken any media job whatsoever, because I think when you're starting out, you shouldn't be fussy about what kind of thing you do, you just want to learn. I got lucky. I worked at a city magazine called Gotham that was all about what's cool and hip in New York. So I got to learn a lot about the city while I was there. But more importantly, it was a really small team, which meant when you work in a small company of any sort, you get to take on a lot of different responsibilities. So I was writing cover stories within 6 months of being there. I just was doing so much more than what my job description said, which is there's no better way to learn. Like I said, this is a job you learn on the job. And so after a few years of that, and if I'd been in a bigger magazine, I would not have been able to do cover stories within 6 months, for sure. But that's kind of how it works if you work at a smaller publication. And after a couple of years, I was ready for the next move. And for me, travel made a lot of sense because I grew up traveling so much. So I moved to a magazine called Travel and Leisure, which was a much bigger publication, but I got to learn from the top editors in the business about how a magazine is put together, what travel stories are interesting to editors. And those were skills that I took very seriously and were really important to me when I moved to my next chapter, which when I moved to South Africa, I went freelance. So freelance means I work for myself. I'm not on staff at a magazine or newspaper anymore. When I moved to South Africa, I initially thought I might look for a job there at a magazine, but I quickly realized that, freelancing, there's a lot more flexibility, and there was a lot of unique opportunities to tell stories from Africa for American magazines. So that's when I took the leap to go freelance. And I've done that mostly ever since. There was a year that I went to Dubai and was editor-in-chief of Condé Nast Traveler's Middle East edition. But other than that, I've been freelance, and I've traveled more than 100,000 miles some years. I've been to dozens of hotels a year in amazing destinations, and this is how I make my living today. So what is travel writing? So travel writing, as we know it today, kind of has its roots in the colonial era. So that means during the days of European empire all over the world, they would send adventurers to different parts of the colonies to report back what they saw. So that means just by nature, there's a lot of exoticism and racism embedded in it, which is still something we deal with today, and I'll talk more about that later, but it's really important to kind of know what the roots are and what it comes from, and it kind of has a sense of othering other destinations. But today, as a function, it is a beat of journalism, which is a kind of specialty, just like news or fashion or sports. And it is a kind of service journalism, as we call it, which is giving helpful tips and guidelines to people who might be wanting to plan a trip. So in this case, you're giving them actual tips, like here are the hotels to stay at, but you're also giving them inspiration, like here's a destination you might not have thought of, but here's why you should add it to your list. It is a real job. Based on my Instagram, people think I'm just constantly on vacation, and I am lucky because I go to places that other people go to on vacation and really have to do all the things that you do when you're on vacation, but there's a lot more that goes on behind the scenes. There's a ton of planning, a lot of logistics, a lot of research, and the planning starts before the trip. During the trip, I'm never sleeping. I'm constantly out doing things to make sure I don't miss the story, and then when I come back, I actually have to write. So there's a lot more research that goes into it, and then I have to write the entire story. So it is a real job. And one of the things I love most about it is the cultural impact that you can have. We live in a really polarized time where a lot of people will only go to news sources based on their political, personal, social, cultural beliefs. And with travel writing, though, everybody loves to travel. So if you're planning a trip, no matter where you fall on what side of the aisle, you're probably going to go to Condé Nast Traveler or the New York Times travel section to get your tips. So as a writer for these sections, you have a really unique opportunity to appeal to people across the board from a wide range of perspectives, and you can really shed light on these communities and cultures that you're passionate about and really reach a wide audience. So that's something that's really important to me. A little bit about guidebook versus journalistic writing, which isn't that relevant anymore today because I don't think anybody actually travels with those big guidebooks. But a lot of travel writers do work on those guidebooks that you might have seen for Lonely Planet and Photos. Those are much more just information-based. It's like, here are all the possible restaurants that you could stay in no matter what you're craving, or eat at no matter what you're craving. Here are all the hotels for different budgets. Here are the times museums are open. That's not what we try to do with journalism. With travel writing for magazines and newspapers, you're not trying to tell the whole story of a place. You're not trying to give you every fact and figure. You're trying to shine a specific light, look at a destination through a very niche focus, so you could tell that story. So instead of here's every restaurant that you might want to go to in Paris, it's here are some cool chefs that are really innovating with these unique ingredients in this one arrondissement in Paris. So that's kind of how they differ. You're not trying to cram everything into one story. And then something you probably are familiar with is content creators. I don't know, do any of you guys follow any YouTubers or TikTokers who do travel? So then you see that's kind of how most of us consume our travel today, travel content. It is different from what I do, but I think they are important functions of travel media and inspiration for people. But travel journalists, usually I write for a newspaper or magazine, and that's who pays me. Whereas travel content creators are usually working in collaboration with a hotel group or a tourism board or a specific brand that they might use a lot when they travel. So that's who's paying their bills, and it's just a different way to do it. They're kind of using their own YouTube or their own Instagram to share their content, whereas my content gets shared through these different publications. And then editing and writing are both really important parts of travel media where, and they're just very different. So writers often go into both of these things and they're just different and important parts of it. Editors are putting the stories together, whereas writers are the ones that are actually writing the story. And some people can do both really well, but usually you either become an editor or a writer. And then on-staff versus freelance is something you'll hear me talk about a lot. When you're on staff at a magazine, you just work at that magazine, either as an editor or a social media person or, sometimes a staff writer if they have that. Whereas as a freelancer, I'm independent, I work for myself, and I can write for any number of different publications. So I don't have to write for just one place. And, when I was working on staff at Travel and Leisure, people assumed, oh, it's such a glamorous job, you're a travel editor. But that's actually a bit of a misconception because travel editors are usually chained to their desks and assigning stories to people like me. And so if you look at any magazine, whether it's travel or otherwise, most of the stories that are in here are actually written by freelance writers. So if this is something you're all interested in, it's just worth thinking about. If you actually want to be out there traveling and writing about it, freelance life is probably going to be for you. And then now that you know about the industry in general, here's a bit about my process. So this is my laptop in Antarctica, floating around by some nice big glaciers or something. And so yeah, when I come up with an idea, the first thing I do is I figure out, why is this a strong idea? That means there's a lot of research involved. I sometimes do pre-interviews where I figure out what the news angle is. I make sure I figure out who I would interview if I'm not doing the pre-interviews. I check to see which publication I think this might be a fit for since I write for so many places. Then I check to see if that publication's ever written anything like that. So well before this idea really takes shape, there's a lot of research that goes into it. Then I send what's called the pitch, where you pitch an editor your idea and why you think it's a good idea, why it's a fit for them. Never just say, I'm going to Paris, do you want a story? You say, I'm going to Paris and there's this neighborhood that has this little interesting art movement happening that nobody's ever covered and your readers are going to love it and I'm going to tell you that story. So that is the pitch. Once the editor comes back and goes, that's amazing, let's do it, here's lots of money, then I have to actually start planning. So that means all the logistics, flights and trains and when things are open. If I'm, the museum I need to go to is closed the one day I'm gonna be in that city. I need to kind of know all the logistics, but it's also planning out who am I gonna interview, where am I gonna go, what am I gonna include, what are the different things that will help really bring this story to life. And I usually create a spreadsheet where I block out day by day an itinerary with this is what I'm gonna do in the morning, this is what I'm gonna do in the afternoon, try to leave as much free time as possible too, but I never just rock up in a place without a plan because sometimes a great story can come out of it, but sometimes it won't. So you can't take that risk when someone's literally paying you to go and tell the story. And then comes the actual traveling and reporting, which once you've done all that legwork, it's actually kind of straightforward. There's a lot, like I said, I'm usually awake a lot. I'm not really sleeping that much because I want to make sure I talk to everyone and see everything and don't miss anything. I usually take notes by hand in a notebook because that gets my creative juices flowing more, but some people prefer to do it on the phone. Sometimes I get to take a friend or family member with me, which is great for them because they're just on vacation while I'm reporting. And then after that I come home and it's time to organize my notes. I usually transcribe everything into a Google Doc so it's easily searchable. And while I'm doing that, I'll pull out, the quotes that really sing and the key scenes that I think are really gonna be very evocative, figure out what might be the opening, what I might close with, and that's when I start actually writing the story. And then once I actually hit send is the editing cycle with the editor, where you go back and forth. They might have some questions, they might clarify things, clean things up. I tend to write really long, so if I get a 1,500 word assignment, I'm probably filing it 2,200 words. Not a good idea, don't do that, but so then the editors will have to cut that with you. And then sometimes there's fact checkers who go through everything to make sure when you say, I ate at this restaurant for breakfast on Tuesday, they make sure it's actually open in the morning on a Tuesday, so they make sure all the facts are right. So it takes a while then for the stories to come out. So if it's digital, it might be out in a few hours after the editing is done. For print, this story that I said I did in India last year, I reported it in September, I filed it in November. The edits were after the holidays, sometime in January, and I think this issue went to print in February, if I'm not mistaken, and it just came out on newsstands last week. So print cycles can be much longer. And then social media, like I said, I'm not a content creator. I'm not making snappy reels everywhere I go, but I do post online a lot while I'm traveling, just to share my trip with people who are following me. And then I do also like to use it to find sources if I'm like trying to interview cool people in the place that I'm going to. And sometimes I just make friends this way. Like I travel solo a lot, so it's nice when I land up in a new city. If somebody's like, "Hey, I live here. I'd love to show you around," then sometimes it's great for making those kind of connections as well. So, are there any questions about the process or any of that so far? No? All right, let's make sure you're still with me. So now I'm going to tell you how that process came to life in a few different stories and how these actually happen. So this is a story I did on Bosnia. Some of it got cut off, but Journey to Bosnia and Herzegovina. And this was for the New York Times, maybe in 2018 or so. There was a lot of anti-refugee and anti-Muslim sentiment bubbling in Europe. And it's also a time that, where people were saying like, "Oh, Muslims aren't from here, like they're coming, they're kind of coming into our borders." And I was like, well, Bosnia is an indigenous Muslim country in the heart of Europe that's always been there, so let's talk about that. So I wanted to do that, and also this is, in the travel world, Croatia was really having a moment in that era. Everybody was going to Croatia, writing all these beautiful travel stories about Croatia. So I was like, well, this is right next door, it must also be beautiful, it's the same region in the Balkans. So I just want to do a story on Bosnia, looking at it through that lens. And so my editor commissioned it, and as you can see, it's absolutely beautiful. This is a city called Mostar, which was stunning. And it was just a really beautiful place to visit and write about. And then this, so I'm a contributing editor at Condé Nast Traveler. So this is an example of a story that came to me because of a relationship that I built now. And they wanted to do a story on Uzbekistan. And so I'm Indian American, but hundreds of years ago, before my ancestors came to India, they were in Uzbekistan. And I know nothing about that chapter in my family's heritage, so I wanted to look at it through the lens of trying to understand the culture and the civilization that my ancestors would have been in the 16 and 1700s at the height of the Silk Road. So that was the approach that I brought to this Uzbekistan story. This is another story that was really meaningful to me. So in 2017, there was a Muslim ban announced, and I don't usually write about politics, but since a travel ban is something that's kind of in my realm of what I cover, I was like, well, let me find a way to speak to this current moment in a way that feels authentic to me and what I would write about. So I pitched my editor at the New York Times that I travel overseas usually. Like as you've seen from my other stories and the pictures, I don't really write about America that much, but now I'm really curious. And so I was like, I want to do a story as a Muslim American woman traveling around my own backyard in this current moment that we're in and just trying to understand the country that I'm from. And so this was just so much fun to report. I did line dancing in Tennessee. I went to Graceland in Memphis. I went to the Mall of America in Minnesota. I went to rodeo in Wyoming. So just like I got to see a lot of these classic Americana things that I don't really see that often, and just like understand my country a bit more. And this also won a lot of awards, and it was probably one of my favorite stories I've ever written. And so this is an example. I wanted to include it because usually when I'm going to any of these places, it's on assignment for that one story, right? So in this case, I was in Ethiopia on assignment for the New York Times doing a story on Addis Ababa, the capital. But I did have some extra time, so I wanted to do something like a personal side trip while I was there. So the city Harar has this interesting Muslim history that I hadn't known about before. So I was just curious about that. So I pitched that. So I went there not for an assignment. I just went there on my own. But anytime I travel, even if it's a vacation, I usually take a lot of notes. So I thought this would be a good story. So separate to the original story I was doing, I pitched this to an editor at Travel and Leisure, and this also won some awards, and as you can see, ended up in Best American Travel Writing, an anthology in 2021. And then this is an example of a story that came to me based on my expertise. So I write about the Middle East and Africa a lot, and so Algeria is a country that has been really closed off to tourism for a long time. It's one of the hardest visas I've ever had to get. But my editor at Bloomberg said that she heard that Algeria was planning on relaxing these visa laws a bit in the coming years. So before that anything changed, she wanted to send me to write about it and to see what it's like, especially because Morocco next door gets so much attention. What is there to see in Algeria? And she came to me because I write about the Middle East and Africa so much, so she thought my perspective would be interesting. And this ended up being an incredibly memorable trip because since the visas are so limited, it was very, very few foreigners there, so it's a really rare opportunity to be in a place that feels untouched by foreign tourism. and that's kind of what Algeria was. And that might change now if they are actually opening up their visas. This was a really fun one to report last year. My editor at Virtuoso Travel magazine, since I write about India so much, asked me to go back to Jaipur, which is known for this beautiful jewelry heritage artisanship, and write about the jewelry scene there, the families that have been doing it for centuries. So I literally got paid to wear millions and millions of dollars of jewelry for a week in Jaipur. Sadly, I didn't get to keep any of it, but I do have the pictures. And so this was a cover story in Virtuoso in January, and that on the cover is the Maharaja of Jaipur. And then, I don't know, like nobody seems to like K-dramas anymore based on what I've asked the last few classes, but does anyone like K-dramas? Okay, a couple of hands this time, finally. So I discovered K-dramas in the pandemic because there was no travel anymore, and I travel for a living, so that was a rough time. So K-dramas kind of gave me that escape that travel usually gives me, where I'm discovering this new culture that I know nothing about, and like learning the nuances of what makes it tick. And so I just got really, really hooked. And then as soon as the pandemic was starting to, countries were starting to reopen, I pitched a story to my editor at Conde Nast Traveler that I've been seeing these like sold through K-dramas for the last year and a half. I just want to go see it in real life. So this was a really fun one to report as a fan. And then I did spend a year, so I usually, for the last 12 years, I've mostly been freelance, but I did spend a year in Dubai as editor-in-chief of Conde Nast Traveler's Middle East edition, which was a really different thing for me and a really fun challenge. When you're editor-in-chief of a brand, you're literally overseeing everything from the events, like I'm hosting an event there, from the advertising, from commissioning stories, because you're not actually writing that much anymore. And it was a really different thing for me to do, but I really enjoyed it. And I think, especially as someone who grew up in Saudi Arabia and has spent a lot of time living in and writing about the Middle East, it was a great opportunity to try to tell thoughtful, nuanced stories from that region, in that region. So it was a really fun challenge. All right, so I'm gonna try a few more of these. And again, if you've already been in a period, please don't guess. Does anyone know where in the world this is? No, okay, this is Victoria Falls in Zimbabwe. Well, it's on the border of Zimbabwe and Zambia. Does anyone know this one? It is Switzerland, yes, thank you. I don't know exactly where in Switzerland, I don't remember anymore, but it's a castle in Switzerland. And this one? Sorry, what? Sahara. No, it's not the Sahara, but it is in Africa. Yep. It is Namibia, yes. This is the death play in near Sossusvlei Dunes, which are some of the tallest dunes. Have you been? You live in Namibia? Oh, that's awesome. This is honestly one of my favorite trips. Like, it's such a cool landscape. How long did you live there? Wow, that's so cool. Well, then you know all about this then. So yeah, this is a really, really like surreal place to be. Really beautiful country. And I think this is the last one I have here. Anyone know where this is? It's also in Africa, if that helps. No? All right, this is in Kenya, an archipelago called Lamu, which it's on the Swahili coast, they call it in Africa, and that is, these are these distinctive dhows, these boats that are called dhows, that you kind of have to do a sunset dhow cruise when you're there. It's really beautiful. All right, so a couple of other things that are really important to me is, well, diversity. We talked about this a little bit before, that travel writing, as it stands, kind of has this bit of a colonial hangover. Diversity is important in all of journalism in terms of what stories we're telling and who gets to tell them and who the editors are that are making the decisions. But I think it's really important to think about that in regards to travel journalism, because you are a visitor in a country and you often don't necessarily have the authority to be telling that country's story. So you need to be really thoughtful about how you tell it, who you choose to speak to, which voices you highlight. I think it's really important to have more diverse writers telling stories, and that doesn't just mean as an Indian American, I shouldn't only write about India. I also think, we want more Black writers writing about Thailand. We want more, Asian writers writing about the US. It's just you want more diverse perspectives to show the world in different lights. And then I think, but no matter who tells a story, the most important thing is you center local voices wherever you can. You want to have the local perspective, what their experience and understanding of their culture is, and not tell the story of a destination through your own lens and your own voice exclusively, because you're just going to project your own thoughts onto it. And something I always say is what one person considers exotic is someone else's daily commute. So you need to be really conscious when you're going to a country as a visitor about what biases you're projecting onto that place. All right, so pros and cons about what I get to do. Amazing travel. I've been on 25 safaris, 7 continents, stayed in some of the best hotels in the world, and it's just, there's a lot of perks, and I don't take it for granted at all. Well, another perk is honestly the unique access that you get to people and places. When you're writing about places, you get to experience things, as a journalist, you get more access than you would otherwise. And you sometimes get to go to a museum on days that it's closed or visit a gallery that's not open yet. But you also get to meet with people and have people who want to tell you their stories in a different way. One thing I always think about is I went to Tunisia to do a story on the design scene, which Tunis, the capital, has a really cool design scene. And I got plugged into one fashion designer who connected me to an interior designer who connected me to another fashion designer, someone who designs games, just craftsmanship, so many interesting people. And I just got literally passed around from person to person. And it was such a fun way to experience the city that if you're going as a traveler or as a tourist, you might not necessarily get that kind of access to a place. Flexibility is honestly, for me, the most important reason that I do what I do, because I don't have a 9 to 5. I get to decide my schedule. I get to sleep in when I want. I get to decide when I do the travel. And it's just amazing to be able to have that kind of flexibility. And then a variety of projects. Right now, I'm working on a coffee table book, and I have a couple of story deadlines in the next week or two. I have a story I just filed for the New York Times. It'll be out next week. That's in edits. I'm working on a book idea. I'm doing voiceovers for some videos that I just shot last week. So there's just always a variety of different things that I'm doing, and it's never a dull day because there's always so many fun things that are in the works. And then at this point in my career, I get to take on what I want to take on. Earlier in your career, you're gonna have to do the grunt work, you're gonna have to do things you don't wanna do, but part of what I love about where I've come now is I just do stories and projects that bring me joy. And then cons, feast or famine. I'm sure you've heard this phrase, but sometimes when it rains, it pours, and you have too much work and you don't know what to do, and you're completely overwhelmed. And sometimes you have nothing, and you're like, am I going to be able to pay my bills this month? It's just the way it works. You kind of have to have faith that some months are going to be slower than others, but and just plan accordingly. So it's not for everyone, but I don't mind it because I've kind of I'm at a point where I feel like I'm comfortable with that. There's no benefits in steady salary. So if you need a consistent paycheck, this is definitely tricky, but at the same time, I feel because there's so many different types of projects you can take on, there's actually a really big income potential here. The no routine thing I think is probably the hardest thing for me, because sometimes I'm able to, to have a pretty steady routine. I get to cook, I eat healthy, I work out, and then other times, last fall, between August and October, I was in Mallorca, Rwanda, Turkey, India, and Algeria and London, maybe somewhere else, all almost back to back, which is a couple of days at home in between. So everything goes out the window then. You're not sleeping well, you're not eating well, you're not working out. So that can be really tough, but that is something that you need to just kind of find a way to balance that. Rejection, no matter what industry you're in, no matter what stage of your career you're at, this is just something you have to get used to. And I've been doing this for 20 years and I still deal with rejection, and all you have to do is have a thick skin and just know that you just have to dust it off and move on to the next person that you're going to pitch and not take it personally. And then there is a challenge with declining pay rates and struggling magazines, the way the media industry is today. But I always argue that with writing, there's always going to be companies and publications and places that need good writers. And sometimes you just have to get creative. Sometimes I do some consulting projects with travel companies and just other work. But writing as a skill is never going to go out of style, and there's always going to be people who need that, and will pay good money for that. And then, has anybody decided they want to be a travel writer after this? Anyone converted? No. Oh, one person. Thank you very much. That makes me feel good. This has not all been in vain. But either way, I just want to give you a little bit of an overview of what kind of things are important in this career. One thing is to read a lot of travel writers. Even at this point, I'm constantly reading other articles and books. And before I start writing any article, I keep a folder called Inspo articles to see what some of my favorite writers have done. Not to plagiarize and copy them, it's just to get inspired by how other writers approach the English language, or might create a scene in an interesting way, and just to kind of get those creative juices flowing. So always be reading. And the other thing, if you're doing travel writing, is to be reading other newspapers and blogs in other countries if you can, because that's how I get a lot of my ideas actually, is just seeing what local newspapers are covering before they've kind of become a huge trend. Ask a lot of questions. You have a license to be nosy in this job. Take full advantage of that. If you're a curious person, there is no better thing to do. And then even if you don't travel a lot, just remember that your hometown is actually a travel destination for other people. So always look for story ideas right in your own backyard. Chicago is constantly on Condé Nast Traveler's list of best cities in America. So that means there's a lot of people that are interested in Chicago. So maybe there's some great stories you can tell from Chicago. And then when you do travel, whether it's study abroad or family vacations, always be looking for interesting story ideas that you can tell from those places too. And if you have the opportunity to move overseas, take it. My career, I think, is what it is today because of the 4 years I spent in South Africa. I really feel like being able to develop that expertise in a region made me valuable to editors, and it helped me kind of really stand out, whereas when you're based in New York, it's competitive. There's so many people that are trying to do the same thing there. That kind of leads into finding a niche. Just because you want to write about travel, there's so many things you can specialize in within travel, whether it's food or wellness or adventure. In my case, I've really specialized in regions like India, Africa, and the Middle East. And so editors think of me when they're thinking they want stories from those regions. So the goal is if an editor wants an adventure story, they think of you. So find things that you can specialize in. And remember that a topic is not a story. You need to find what makes it a really good story. So ask yourself these questions. Why this? Why now? And why me? Am I the right person to tell this? And before we close, I just want to do a few more of these. Does anyone want to guess where this is? It's close to Italy, very close, culturally and geographically, but not Italy. It's Malta. I think I heard Malta. It's really close to Sicily, but yeah, Malta. This one? Spain, not Baltimore, no. Seville, Spain. This one? India, yes. Tiger Safari in Ranthambore National Park in Rajasthan. And I think this is the last one. Anyone? I know you're going to guess it, right? What? Cape Town, yes, Cape Town. That is the top of Lion's Head Mountain, which is a popular hike in Cape Town. And that is it for me. Does anyone have any questions? All right, here. The scariest experience I've had in a foreign country. Huh. So I'm lucky I haven't had like horror story type things, but I do think when I was in Algeria last year, I missed a flight. And I've missed flights before. I travel solo a lot. But because there's a lot of bureaucracy and there's a lot of like language barrier, so trying to get to where I needed to go with like a rerouted thing on my own was just really overwhelming. So I think I'm lucky. I haven't had like any treacherous type of experiences, but there's been things like that where you're in a foreign country, you're already exhausted, and you're trying to navigate something new. So I think that's always something that can come up. Anyone else? Up there?
What was probably the best dish you've ever had? Which continent has the best dish?
Oh, Africa has the best food by far. Tunisia is the best street food I've ever had. There's this dish called Loblebi, which I think you guys would love it in Chicago because it's like, it warms you from like your hair to your toes. It is just like this bowl of chickpeas and sauces and the spicy sauce harissa that they have there is phenomenal. It's just like this incredibly decadent, delicious dish. South Africa has some of the best food I've ever eaten. I just did a food story in Kigali in Rwanda last year, which was unbelievable. So I think some of the most exciting food that's coming out is definitely in Africa right now. Anyone else? Right there in the back?
Where's the longest place that took you to travel?
The longest place that it took me to travel? I do a lot of long haul trips, like overall, as far as, I do a lot of Africa and Asia and stuff, which are long flights with connections. The longest single flight I've ever done was from Dallas to Sydney, which I think at that time was the longest flight in the world. I think it was 17 hours. And I knew, why I always say that I sleep well on long haul flights in my bio is because I slept for basically 12 hours of the 16-hour flight in the back seat of the plane, in the last row of economy, right next to the toilets, in the middle seat, in a seat that didn't recline, and I still slept for that long. So I have skills in that area. Anyone else? Right here?
When did you know for sure you were gonna do this?
I knew I was going to be a journalist, like I said, when I was 8, because that's all I like telling stories, and because I had my mom as an example as a freelance journalist, I knew that was a way to tell a story. As far as when I knew I wanted to be a travel writer, that was much later. I think it was after I started working in Travel and Leisure magazine in New York, where I saw the power of telling, I was editing, I wasn't actually traveling or doing the writing, but I saw how beautiful the stories were and how powerful they were, and I think I just knew that I wanted to do that. And so that was probably much later in my career. Up there?
What languages have you had to learn, and what's that been like?
So I haven't actually actively learned any languages through what I do. I speak Urdu fluently, which is an Indian language, which helped me in a lot of South Asia. And then I have a little bit of French and Spanish from when I was in high school that always kind of comes back when I'm in French or Spanish speaking countries, which is also really helpful. But I think, I don't like learn too many languages. I've tried to do Duolingo in a few, but it's not very helpful, I don't think. Usually, I was like sometimes I've used Google Translate to actually use like when I'm trying to interview people or get some questions answered for a story. So I'll literally just type it in, pass it over, they type it back. So technology is pretty amazing. And sometimes I'll hire a tour guide, like a private tour guide who can be my translator if I'm going to need to do a lot of interviews. So, yep. Any other questions? Right here?
Do you have a photographer that travels with you?
No, I don't. That's a really good question. People are really curious about that. So I don't shoot my own photos, and then usually the way it works at magazines, like for instance this story that I did in India, I went in September, I wrote the story, I filed it to my editor, then there's a photo team at every magazine, and they look at the story that you filed, and they decide which photographer they're going to send based on your story. So they're always traveling in my footsteps, essentially. So I don't usually take, I never take pictures, and I've only traveled with a photographer like once or twice I think. Anyone else? Right here?
What security measures do you take to make sure that you're safe since you travel alone?
When I travel alone, what security measures I take? So that's a really good question because I do travel alone a lot and in some places that, might be concerning to my parents. So I usually, where I can, I find somebody, like I said, I use social media sometimes to find people to meet up with and hang out with. So I always try to find people so I'm not truly alone. I usually stay at nice, like respected hotels where I know the staff will take good care of me. And I often, if I'm in a place that feels less safe, I'll book a car and drive her through the hotel because I feel like they're gonna make sure I'm taken care of. And then often if I'm traveling solo, I'll hire a tour guide that will be my private tour guide that will make sure I navigate everything safely. Any more? Right here?
Obviously, you've got a lot of inspiration around you when you travel, but do you ever get writer's block where you're just like, why can't I get this?
Always. That is actually a vital part of my writing process. My husband discovered this when we first got married and I was doing my first story. I think it was a Malta story, where I literally melt down. I'm like, I cannot write. I don't know how to do this anymore. I've lost it. I'm going to leave the country, change my identity, never return. My editor is going to be so mad. And then I melt down, and then the next day write something brilliant and finish it. So I think it's actually like every story, there always is, for me personally, I'm not saying this is the case with every writer, there's always this moment of self-doubt before I actually get into the zone. And that's when I know that like the zone is coming when I'm having that meltdown. So now my husband's used to it. Any more questions? Oh, back there? That is another great question. So I was not traveling at all, obviously, and so it was really tough. I did question a lot of what I was going to do, if it was going to work. I pivoted. I started writing a bit for Netflix's magazine because I was watching a lot of Netflix. So I literally was like, hey, Netflix looks like it has a magazine. I'm watching their shows all the time. I should write for them. I did more entertainment writing. I did more food writing. I did do, actually, the story I did from Ethiopia that I mentioned, that was in the Best American Travel Anthology, that one was something I pitched in the pandemic about a past trip. So I'd already done the main story I was there for, but I used that time to find other story ideas from places I'd already been to. So I had to be really creative. It was definitely a struggle, but it worked out. Yep.
Have you ever seen other people's work which you thought of it for or something similar?
Always. She asked if I've ever seen other people's work and wish I'd gone with it before or thought of it all the time. That's just the thing with freelancing. You're always like, oh, that's such a good idea. I wish I'd thought of it. It's just kind of the way it is. All right. Thank you guys so much.